Okay, we're getting ready to blueprint this motor. The cylinder walls are bored 20 over on this motor. Our main bearing cap to block surfaces here are stock. We did not get it line hone or bored. All the blueprinting we're getting ready to do, you can actually do before you send anything to the machine shop to make sure everything specs out. Like as far as the cylinder walls, you can go ahead and measure it out with a dial bore gauge and spec it out with the factory service manual specs. And if it specs out, then you don't need to bore it out. You can just leave it standard and order the piston. But if it's out of spec, you want to get it bored, say bored 20 over, then you'll need to get 20 over pistons. If you want to bore it 40 over, you'll need to get 40 over pistons, and so on. Just like your main bearing surfaces here, where your crank's going to sit, all your crank bearings, you can go ahead and measure all this out to see if you need to get line bored or honed or anything, or you can just leave it stock if it's within spec. Also, your deck of your block, you can measure it and make sure it's true and flat and level before you get it surfaced, so you don't have to get it surfaced that much. You can just get it cleaned up and get the gasket cleaned off of it. All the stuff we're going to go over, the crankshaft and everything, all the blueprinting we're going to do, you can do before, just to make sure for one, everything's good or not, and two, to make sure the machine shop did their work properly. And also, like I said before, you definitely want to do it to see what type of pistons you need to buy. Like if you just want your machine shop to do this work for you, then you need to wait before you buy pistons, because they might need to bore 40 over, and if you got 20 over pistons, that's not going to work. You're going to need 40 over pistons. You definitely want to make sure you have everything ready before you get too far ahead of yourself. A really big thing to consider as far as blueprinting, it takes a lot of time and a lot of patience. And of course it takes extra tools that you normally wouldn't have. So that's more money. One of the biggest reasons why I would blueprint a motor over paying someone to do it, it's your motor, it's your money, you're going to be more precise with it. As far as the tools you're going to need to blueprint the motor, you need some blueprinting log sheets, which if you want to use the ones I use, you can download from my website. You'll need the piston spec sheet. You'll need a dial bore gauge set. I have a digital gauge that I use on my dial bore gauge versus the analog because it's much more precise readings. You'll need a calculator. Any regular calculator will work. You'll need a pen to write on your log sheets with, of course. When you're going to get machine work done on your block, like say for the piston bore, you want to make a copy of your piston sheet and give it to the machine shop so they'll know what your clearances is and what it needs to actually be bored to and everything, so they can check off that. Okay, what we have here is a set of micrometers and a caliber. The main thing you want to look for when you're buying micrometers, you don't have to have the digital ones, you can just have a regular micrometer like this one here. But the biggest thing you want to look for is the size they measure down to, where all of these here measure 0.00005 inch, which is 5/100,000ths of an inch. But what we'll be measuring with this motor is 1/10,000th of an inch. So you can go smaller than that, but you cannot go bigger than that. Where this calibers here measured 1/10,000th of an inch, but the rest of these measuring 5/100,000ths of an inch. So these are well over what we need. I use the calibers for various things. I use these 0 to 1 inch micrometers. They have a ball tip on the ends here. I use these to measure bearings. This 1 to 2 inch set here, I use these to measure the rod journals in the crankshaft. The 2 to 3 inch, I use these to measure the main journals in the crankshaft. And the 3 to 4 inch I use to measure the pistons. And then this here is a micrometer stand. It actually holds a micrometer so you don't have to, and you can actually hold something on here and measure it rather than holding the micrometer and whatever you're measuring. This is just a standard set of micrometers, but they measure in 1/10,000th of an inch, which is 0.0001 inch. This is a 2 to 3 inch set of micrometers. Like I said before, you don't have to spend the money on the digital ones. You can just use regular ones if you like. But the digital ones are a whole lot easier. As you can see here, I've modified my engine stand. I cut it out right here and moved my block down. It's flipped over, so this is actually down. So my holes here will line up better, and I can insert my dial bore gauge. You'll need to move your handle because it gets in the way. And you have number 5 and number 4 that you're going to want to get your measurements for. So you'll go ahead and insert your dial bore gauge through number 5 to get to number 4. You'll take your measurements. As you can see, there's plenty of room now to get measurements all the way around on number 4 as well as number 5. There's plenty of room. Where before, this arm would be hitting the engine stand. So if you want to modify your engine stand just like I have, you'll cut down 1 1/8 or 1 1/4 inch by 3 inches wide, and that'll be plenty enough. Okay, when you're going to clean your block, you definitely want to clean out all your oiling holes and your water holes, and all you need to do is take some parts cleaner, shoot in the holes. As you can see, it's running out everywhere. And then take your air compressor and shoot in the holes. And you're going to do that all over the block. You have oiling holes on each journal. You have your oil squirter holes down on each cylinder. You get all your stuff on the front here, all your watering holes and everything. And all this stuff here on the front, the surface rust is from when we got it hot tanked. They dipped it down in the hot tank, and since it didn't get no paint or oil on it, it's just wanting surface rust a little bit. You can just spray that with parts cleaner and take a little brush or whatever, a toothbrush. It'll all clean up, and you can probably go ahead and remove your main bearing beam if you want to get it all clean and get in there easily. But you got holes everywhere. Make sure you shoot all your bolt hole locations and everything. Make sure there's no metal, dirt, dust in the motor anywhere. Okay, when you're going to clean your crankshaft, just use some parts cleaner, and you have an oiling hole on both sides of each journal, except for your journal right here. This one don't have an oiling hole, and the two journals on the ends don't have an oiling hole. You just want to spray the parts cleaner all over the crankshaft and wipe it down. Just take you some blue towels and wipe everything down really good. We got the deck of our block surfaced. We just got it surfaced down just enough to remove the old gasket off so we don't mess with our compression. But if you're going to use a metal head gasket, I highly recommend telling your machine shop to get it surfaced down to a mirror finish on the block and on the head. The metal head gaskets are known to leak unless you have a mirror finish on the block and the head. And also another thing to note is you need to find out from a machine shop how much they surfaced off of it, because if they go down too far, it's going to mess with your compression, which you can make up for how much they surfaced down with a metal head gasket, multi-layered gasket. But in our case, we're just going to use a stock head gasket, so we didn't want to get too much surface off of it. Okay, before you go check the levelness of the deck of your block, I'm going to go ahead and clean it off too. You can never be too clean. And as you see, the towel's tearing up because they're going to cross the sharp edges here. Be careful and make sure they don't go down in the hole. You want to be as clean as possible. We'll clean this up again before we go to assembly anything, but you definitely don't want to get that stuff down in there. So keep an eye out for that. Next thing, you gotta get something that you know is true and level. What I mean by true is that it's totally flat on the surface here, because you're gonna check the levelness of the deck of the block here. Your limit is 0.010 millimeter. Okay, first thing we're gonna check is this side over here. You wanna make sure you put your straight edge in the center of the head bolt locations here. You wanna take your feeler gauge and see if you can get it in between there. If you can't, you're good. Or that one there is good. Move on to the second one now. Again, making sure your straight edge is in the center of the bolt holes. That one's good. Check the third one. That one's good. Check the fourth one. That one's good. Okay, now we'll check the fifth one. That one's good. We'll check the sixth one. And that one's good too. So the surface of our block specs out good. If your limit was off, then you'll have to take it back to the machine shop and tell them that they need to resurface it again because they didn't get it level. No matter how much your machine shop states they clean things, you always need to check it. So if you see here inside the oil squirter, there is a bunch of metal in the hole there, which they obviously did not get out. I'm not even sure what that came from. That is a big old chunk of metal come out of the oil squirter hole. It definitely was not supposed to be in there, and that could have done some serious damage right there. So make sure you check everything. Okay, looking at the piston sheet that comes with your pistons, they're saying measure 1.100 from the bottom of your oil groove. We already have our caliper set up. You'll take it and you'll measure from the bottom of your oil groove down right there. Just take a Sharpie, make a dot, and do the same on the other side. And also looking at the piston sheet again, you're going to have a .0040 clearance, and over here your finished bore size is supposed to be 3.524. So you get that 4 from your clearance here, so the piston should mic out at 3.520. And you want to measure your points that you just made with your measurements there. So you'll use your 3 to 4 inch micrometer. And there it is right there, 52000. That'll be 3.520 right there. And you measure all 4 of them just like that. All 4 of our pistons measured out the exact same, which they should. Okay, what we have here is a dial bore gauge that I got off of eBay for like 30 bucks. And then I have a digital gauge here rather than the analog one. Basically the way the dial bore gauge works, so you got to remove your top off. We're going to do our cylinder bores, which should be 3.524. So we're going to use a 3.4 and a .10, which will make 3.5. Slide that spacer on there and slide it onto the dial bore gauge and screw your holder on. Go ahead and loosen up your top. Turn your gauge on. You want to insert it into the hole until it gets a reading, and hold it there, tighten it up, and then go and zero it out. Basically the way it works, has a little button on the back. When that presses in, your reading goes up on your gauge, like so. And sometimes it'll stick like that. See how it's stuck on 2? So you want to just kind of push it in and let it come back out till it goes back on 0 before you stick it back in the bore. Because if you don't, your readings will be off. If you got a more expensive arm here, it would probably not stick. But what we're setting up for is 3.524 because that's what our spec sheet calls for on our pistons. Okay, to set your dial bore gauge up, take your 3 to 4 inch micrometer, set it up to 0.5240 because that's what our spec sheet's calling for, is 3.524. And you got a point on your button on the back and then the point on the other end. You want to get those in the center of your points on your micrometer. It's a little bit of a task to do, but what you want to do when you get in there, you'll rock it back and forth until you get your biggest number, and then you'll zero your gauge out. This is time consuming, but you want to take your time and get it right, because if not, your measurements will be off and then you'll just be wasting your time. Take your time, get your biggest number. It's like 92 is the biggest number. Zero it out. And your dial bore gauge is ready. It's negative 92 now, so you know it's still set up. So if you go to pull it out of the bore and it doesn't say negative 92, you know you're off. You need to flick your little button on the back until it zeroes it out to negative 92. Okay, what you want to do with the dial bore gauge is make the wheels come forward like that so your button can press on the cylinder wall. This end over here does nothing, it's stationary. Insert it in, rock it back and forth, and you're going to go about a quarter of the way down for taper, the center for your out of round, and a quarter from the bottom up for your taper number 2. You're just going to rock it back and forth until you get your readings. You're going to want to get as close to 0 as possible because your dial bore gauge is already set up to 3.524, which is what your bore is supposed to be, because these cylinder walls are bored 20 over. Okay, next, your piston has a pin surface because your piston pin goes through here to hold it on the rod, and then you have a thrust surface the other side. Your pin surface points forward to the front and the back of the motor like so. And your thrust surface is on the sides, the left and the right. Before you go take any measurements on your cylinder walls, just take some parts cleaner and a blue rag, spray it on there, and then just clean your bore out. Just wipe your cylinder walls, because any kind of dirt, dust, or anything in there is going to knock your measurements off. As you see how much dirt actually came off of there. Never use a dirty rag on the wall because you could possibly scratch it. You can see the cross lines in here where they honed it. That's going to help your piston rings to seat properly. And they also put a small chamfer on the edge here, which they do after they bore it out. Okay, what we're going to do now is we're going to check our taper on number 1 cylinder. We're going to check the thrust surface and the pin surface. Top and bottom is your taper. And the center, side to side, is going to be your out of round. So it's still set up at negative 92. Insert it into the bore a quarter of the way down. Rock it back and forth till you get your biggest number. If it goes into the positive, it is underbored, which means the cylinder is too small. If it goes into the negative, it is overbored, which means the cylinder is too big. You want to get your biggest number, 3/10,000ths of an inch, underboard on the top. Now we'll do the bottom measurement. Again, making sure that your dial bore gauge is still set up. Insert it in and go all the way down to the bottom, a quarter way up from the bottom up. And do the same thing. Take your time. You can move it up and down just a little bit to see if it varies. Looks like 3/10,000ths of an inch on the bottom too. And again, make sure your dowel bore gauge is still set up. Insert it in, quarter of the way down. Looks like 3/10,000ths of an inch there. We'll go ahead and go down to the bottom, quarter of the way up. Do the same thing. It looks like the bottom is dead on 3.524 because it's zeroed out. It doesn't go positive any more than that. So we'll go ahead and write all that down on our log. Okay, now we're going to check our out around on cylinder 1. Again, making sure your dowel bore gauge is still set up. Insert it in. Go halfway down. You can take a ruler and measure it and make some marks on the inside if you want to, or you can eyeball it. I like to just kind of move the gauge around here and there just to get a good idea of where it is, what kind of measurements you're getting all the way through. This one here is dead on to 3.524 on your pin surface. Okay, now we're going to check the thrust surface for our out around. Again, making sure your dowel bore gauge is set up. Insert it in to the cylinder, halfway down. As you've seen, I was 2/10,000ths off. So I'm moving it up and down just a little bit. See how much it varies. And it's not varying at all. It's still 2/10,000ths of an inch. So write that down on our log. Okay, go on your log sheet. I already have all my measurements logged in. What you want to do next is take 3.5240, which is your bore size, which is your supposed to be bore size. And since this is a positive number, you will subtract. Because remember, when you get a positive number, your bore is smaller. And when you get a negative number, your bore is bigger. So since we're supposed to be 3.5240, because the spec sheet calls for that, we have to subtract 0.0003, 3/10,000ths, and that's what we'll get. So we'll go ahead and write that down on our log sheet, 3.5237, and that's actually what we're going to get on all three of these, except for this one here because it's perfect, 3.5240. And what we're doing here is taper, which basically all taper is, you got two straight lines, one of them is off, which gives you a taper, one end bigger and the other end smaller. That's all a taper is. And you're only allowed 4/10,000ths of an inch of taper. If you go over 4/10,000ths, you're out of spec, and they didn't bore it properly. So what you got to do is you got to take A minus B, and that equals your clearance. Whereas these two here, your pin surface on the top and your pin surface on the bottom was exactly the same, your clearance is going to be 0. So you're good on that one. On your thrust surface here, the top and the bottom, you're going to take 3.527, you're going to minus 3.5240, and that's going to equal 3/10,000ths of an inch off. But you're allowed 4/10,000ths of an inch, so we're still within spec by 1/10,000th of an inch. So let's just say, for example, this top number was 5/10,000ths of an inch, and this one on the bottom was perfect. You would be out of spec by 1/10,000th of an inch because you're only allowed 4/10,000ths, and it would be 5/10,000ths, so you'd be out of spec by 1/10,000th of an inch. But as far as these measurements, we're good. And again, I can't express it enough. Make sure you take as many measurements as possible and as much time as possible to get these measurements accurate. Because if you do not, you're basically wasting your time. There's no need to blueprint anything unless you're going to take the time to do it and do it properly. Okay, next we got the out of round for our cylinders, and you have your pin and your thrust surface. And what my markings are here is we use a 3.5 inch dial bore gauge, and our piston spec sheet calls for 3.5240 for our cylinder bore, no more than 3.5240. So what we got on our pin surface for our out of round was perfect, so it would be 3.5240. And for our thrust surface, we're going to take 3.5240 and we're going to minus, because it's a positive number, you minus positive and you add negative numbers. So we'll go ahead and minus this, 0.0002, which is 2/10,000ths of an inch. Equal that, you get 3.5238. So what you're going to do now is you're going to take x minus y equals your clearance, which x is our pin surface, y is our thrust surface. So you'll just minus this by 3.5240, and it equals 2/10,000ths of an inch. And you're allowed 6/10,000ths of an inch. So we're within spec on this one. And you're going to do all your cylinders this way, all 4 of them. The same way we did with the taper, the same way with out of round. You're going to do all 4 of them the exact same way we just did. Again, these are all measurements of a 20 overboard cylinder. So if you have a 40 over or standard, your numbers are going to be different. And also the reason we're adding and subtracting these is because, like, say this one here, the 2/10,000ths of an inch, I had my dial bore gauge set up to 3.5240. I measured the cylinder with my dial bore gauge and I got 2/10,000ths of an inch on my dial bore gauge, which is underboard. So then I have to take the 3.5240 and minus the 2/1000ths to get my actual cylinder wall measurement. On the front of the crankshaft here, you have numbers stamped on. On top, you have 4. Those are for your rods, which in our cases we got 1, 1, 1, and 1. That's for our rod journals and our crankshaft. And then below that, you have 5 for the crankshaft main journals. We have 1, 1, 1, 1, and 1. Here on our block, we have a stamp for number 1 main journal is a 2. Number 2 main journal is a 2. Number 3 main journal is a 1. Number 4 main journal is a 1. And number 5 main journal is a 1. Okay, on your main bearings, the ones here that are smooth go in your girdle. They're your bottom bearing. And the one here with the groove in it and the oiling hole is your top bearing. These go in your block, where this hole here is for your oil and this groove here distributes the oil. And also, if you look on the ends here, there's a little tab on here that actually hooks it onto the block and the girdle, which holds it into place. There's one on every bearing. And these here are your thrust bearings. These go in journal number 3. Now what you're going to want to do is mic out the bearing. You can mic it on top and bottom just to make sure it's level all the way across, but we'll take it on our micrometer. I'm using a ball type micrometer, because if you used a regular one, it wouldn't fit over the roundness of the bearing. You either got to use a point type or a ball type micrometer. These should be measuring out about 0.0720. You always want to use the clicker. You don't ever want to use the thimble when you're measuring something with a micrometer. There's 72 on that side. We'll flip it over. Measure the other side. There's 72 on that side. You want to keep measuring in various places just to make sure you're getting accurate readings and consistent readings. But all these bearings should mic out at 0.0720. But of course, if you're using a different grade of bearings, then yours is going to mic out a little different, because you actually have 5 different grades of standard bearings. Okay, what we have here is the standard grade bearing chart from the factory service manual. You have 5 different grades. You have black, brown, green, yellow, and blue. The black is 0.0717 to 0.0719, which is 2/10,000ths difference in thickness. So this actual black bearing, when you go to mic it out, should mic out in between 0.0717 to 0.0719. The brown bearing should mic out in between 0.0719 to 0.0720. The green bearing should mic out around 0.0720 to 0.0722. The yellow bearing should mic at around 0.0722 to 0.0723, and the blue bearing should mic at around 0.0723 to 0.0725. So before you go to install your stock bearings that was in your motor to begin with, you will want to mic them out to see what they mic out at. Let's just say, for example, your bearing in journal number 1 mic'd out with good oil clearance, and you wanted to reuse that type of bearing, and let's just say it mic'd out around 0.0718, then you would buy a black bearing that mics out in between 0.0717 to 0.0719, because 0.0718 would be in that range. But of course, if you don't have your bearings like we don't, then you're going to have to buy a set of bearings, then mic them out to see what they are, to see what range they're in, and then install them on the motor and torque the girdle down and measure the ID with the dial bore gauge. And then if you're off on your oil clearance, then you have to buy another bearing. You don't necessarily have to buy a whole set, you can just buy one bearing, but that's basically how it's going to work. Then looking at the chart from the factory service manual on your main crankshaft journals, you have 3 different grade numbers, 0, 1, and 2. Each journal will have a stamp on it for the crankshaft, which I showed you before. Let's just say, for example, your number 1 journal was stamped number 1. That does not necessarily mean that it's going to spec out these numbers here, 2.3606 to 2.3609, because you could have had pretty bad bearing wear on that journal, or a previous owner could have had that crankshaft polished, or anything. I mean, there could be all kinds of things throwing it off, so you don't necessarily going to go off this chart. But for a standard size crankshaft, it's going to go from 2.3603 to 2.3612. And the same with your pin journal, which is your rod journal. You have a 1.9668 to 1.9675, and you have 3 grades on it as well. Okay, let's say, for example, you're using a black bearing that measures 0.0718. This is your stock bearings that was in your motor before you tore it down. And let's just say you mic'd everything out, your crankshaft and everything, and you were off 4/10,000ths of an inch of oil clearance. So what you do is you'd add 0.0004, 4/10,000ths, and that gives you 0.0722. So what you'd have to do is get a bearing that measures that. So you could either get a green or a yellow bearing. Now, of course, if you use the green bearing, you could possibly have a little bit more clearance. The bearing could actually measure 2/10,000ths smaller than what it needs to be, because this bearing measures from 0.0720 to 0.0722. So that's 2/10,000ths of an inch difference in thickness there. Where if you go to the yellow one, the worst case scenario, it's going to be 1/10,000ths too thick, because there's only 1/10,000ths difference. So I would say you'd be safe on this one with the yellow bearing. This is how you figure out what type of bearings you're going to need. Like I said before, if you don't have your stock bearings and you have to buy a set of bearings, probably one way you can figure out how to get your bearings down, I mean, it's not going to be dead on, but you get an average, is measure your crankshaft journal, and depending on how small, large it was within spec, would be how you could buy your bearings. And of course, it's going to be off because you don't have any kind of measurements of your main journals in your block. Some people would say you could measure the ID of your main journals without the bearings installed, but I've done it and it's not accurate, because after you take those measurements and then you get your bearings and install it in your motor and torque everything down and measure the ID of it, it does not spec out the exact same. Okay, normally after you have your block all cleaned up and everything, you would go and install your stock bearings back in that you had in your motor before, so you could mic it all out and get your oil clearances to see what kind of bearings you actually need to buy. But since we lost our bearings, we actually have our tops, but we lost our bottom somehow. Works out good for the video, because now we'll be able to show you what to do in case something like that happens to you, like you get a motor that didn't have the bearings or whatever. I actually have another set of bearings that I have for another motor that did not get used. It's got a few little scratches on it, but don't worry about that. That's from where we were micing it out before. Be perfectly fine. I'm going to go ahead and install these in and torque the girdle down to spec, and then measure them out to see where our oil clearance is at, to see if we need to buy a new set of bearings or if we can actually use these. So this is your thrust bearing here. You have your little groove here, your little tab goes in the little groove hole right here on the block, and you have your oiling holes and your oiling holes on your bearings. Let's go ahead and install it now. You just take something that's plastic and just tap it down. Plastic or rubber work just fine. It's going to have a little bit of a lip on each side, which is called bearing crush. It's made into the bearings. When you go to torque it down, it'll crush it down. Go ahead and install the rest of the bearings. And now when you go to install these bearings, you have the tab on this side, but you don't have a tab on this side. So you need to definitely make sure that it's in the center, because if it's not, you could actually catch the crankshaft on the edge here if it's not centered up with the bottom bearing when you put the girdle on. So that's something you want to check out. Like if you go to put the girdle on and torque it down, check all your bearings right here on this side where it doesn't have a tab and make sure they're all lined up well. And if they're not, then loosen up your girdle and adjust your bearings and then torque it down to spec. And all your oil holes should line up with the oil holes in the bearings. As long as you bought the right bearings for the right block, you should not have to worry about drilling any oil holes out. We'll go ahead and install the bearings on the girdle now. Same way, it has a little notch on the girdle here for your tabs on your bearings there. And your thrust bearing goes on number 3. And your bottom bearings here are totally flat. They don't have any oiling holes or grooves or anything. And the same with these, try to make sure you get them in the center as much as possible. They should normally line up fairly well, but I have had a couple that did knock off a little bit. Okay, if you're going to use ARP main studs, I would go ahead and use them now. It has a 4mm Allen head on top. You have 3 long ones. One goes on number 3 journal, and the other 2 go on the back journal, number 5. This is the front of the motor, this is the back of the motor. You're going to want to take a little bit of assembly lube that come with your stud kit. Squeeze a little bit on the threads there. You just need to get a little bit on one side. It'll smear around as you thread it in. Go ahead and thread it all the way down. As soon as you hit the bottom, back it off and then snug it back up. You don't want them to get real tight, just snug them up a little bit. And I always take a blue rag and wipe the excess assembly lube off. Keeps everything clean. We'll go ahead and do the other 2 big ones. The assembly lube's not going to hurt anything if you leave it on there. I just like to get it off to keep things cleaner. Now we got the 3 long ones in, we'll go ahead and install the rest of them. The rest of them are all the same length. Okay, we'll go ahead and install our girdle on now. We're installing on dry because we're going to mic out our journals with the bearings installed. And if you have any kind of lube or anything on, it'll throw your readings off. When you're installing your ARP washers, take a little bit of lube and put it on both sides of it. It'll smear around as it goes on there. There's no actual top or bottom on these washers. Now I like to take a little bit and put on the threads here for the nut. And then I always put a little bit on the bottom of the nut here too, so it surface around. These nuts are 12 millimeter and they're 12 point, which means you'll need a 12 point socket. Now what we're going to want to do is take number 1 and number 2 and tighten them down a little bit at a time to get the girdle to go all the way down to the block, and then we'll torque it down to spec. All this is doing is bringing the girdle down to the block evenly. When you get all the way down, then we'll go ahead and start torquing. There is no actual stops on the girdle to keep it from going a little too forward or back too far. So you want to keep an eye on it, and at the same time I'll show you a trick later when you get the crankshaft installed how to line it up properly. But for now, we just want to get it close. Just make sure your bearings are lined up. Like before we go ahead and torque it down, you could probably check your bearings like I was telling you before and make sure they're all lined up before we actually go ahead and torque it down. Now we're going to go ahead and torque them down in a 3-step process. First of all, I'm going to start off with 15 foot-pounds, starting with number 1. Number 2, number 3, number 4, number 5, number 6, number 7, number 8, number 9, number 10. Now we're going to do 31 foot-pounds, starting with number 1. Number 2, number 3, number 4, number 5, number 6, number 7, number 8, number 9, and number 10. Now we'll do final torque of 41 foot-pounds, starting with number 1. Number 2, number 3, number 4, number 5, number 6, number 7, number 8, number 9, and number 10. Now if you got your main journals, a line hone or board, and you're using the ARP studs, you need to torque them down to 60 to 65 foot-pounds in a 3-step process like this. Since ours is stock, we didn't get any line honing or boring done on our main journals. We're going to stick with factory specifications. Okay, basically what you're going to do when you're going to mic this out with a dial bore gauge, you're going to insert your dial bore gauge. This is the front of the bearing, and this is the back of the bearing. And you can measure the back and the front in 3 spots. This is your center, this is your right, and this is your left. And that's your front side, and this is your back side, left, center, and right. Now what we want to do is get our pin so it'll take a measurement. We have a 2.2 inch pin in here right now. We're not getting a measurement. So now we're going to take it off and try a 0.05 spacer. And we have our dial bore gauge zeroed out. We'll insert it into the bearing. Still getting no reading. Now we're going to leave the 0.05 on there, and we're going to add a 0.10 spacer. And now we're getting a reading. Basically what we have in here is a 2.2 pin, a 0.05 spacer, and a 0.10 spacer. So that gives 2.35 inch. And what we're going to do here is we're going to get our measurements everywhere. We're going to write them down on our log. Okay, now with our dial bore gauge zeroed out, we're going to check number 1 main journal. We're going to check the front right side first. You're going to insert your dial bore gauge, and you're going to rock it back and forth until you get the biggest number on the dial bore gauge, which looks like 0.0205. And you can move it around slightly from left to right just to make sure that your readings are accurate and stay pretty consistent in that area, which they seem to be. 0.0205. Write that down. Looks like 0.0201. We'll write that down. Dial bore gauge set to 0. We'll check the center. Looks like 0.0205. Now with the dial bore gauge set to 0 again, we'll check the back right side of the bearing. Looks like 0.0202. Now we'll check the left side on the back. Looks like 0.0203. Now we'll do the center back. And make sure your pins don't go in the oiling holes or anything, or the cracks in the bearings, or of course your readings will be off. Looks like 0.0207. And you're going to do all 5 journals this way. This is just number 1 that we just got finished with, so you're going to do all 5 like that. We're going to do 1, 2, and 3 from the front, and then we're going to come back on the back side and do number 4 and number 5 from the back side. Okay, now you have all 6 of your measurements from your number 1 main journal. You're going to want to get an average from all of these. So what you're going to do is you'll add all of them, 0.0205 plus 0.0201 plus 0.0205 plus 0.0202 plus 0.0203 plus 0.0207 equals, and then you're going to divide this by however many numbers you have, which we have 6, so we'll divide by 6. My dial bore gauge only measures to 1/10,000th of an inch. If you have one that measured in 1/100,000th of an inch, then you'd be good on that. But since we have one that measured 1/10,000th of an inch, what we're going to do is we're going to take the 8 and round the 3 up to a 4. If you have one that measured in 100,000th of an inch, you could put 0.02038. But since we don't, we're just going to round this one up. So that's going to give us 0.0204. This is going to be our average number. So that's going to be our average number for our main journal number 1, the bearing surfaces. Okay, now what I'm going to do is set my dial bore gauge to 0.0204. Now we're set up. It's negative 0.0204, so you know you're set up. Now you're going to take it on your micrometer and zero the gauge out, and then whatever the reading is on the micrometer is your actual reading. You have a pin on the back of the dial bore gauge and a pin on the front. You're going to want to center them on the pins of the micrometer. It's a very tedious process, but you want to make sure you do it right, or your readings will be off and you'll be wasting your time. So if you have a positive reading on your dial bore gauge, you want to back off the micrometer until you zero it out. Because basically on your dial bore gauge, you're going to have it zero out and only show negative readings, no positive readings at all. So once you zero it out, you want to move the dial bore gauge around on the pins of the micrometer and see if you can get any positive readings. And if you do, then you want to back off on the micrometer. As you see, I'm only getting negative readings. So we're zeroed out. Which is a 2 to 3 inch micrometer. So we have 2.36290. And that is my actual ID of my main bearing number 1, the average I got off of 0.0204. So we're actually going to take this measurement and minus it from the OD of our crankshaft main journal number 1, and that's going to give us our oil clearance. And you're going to want to do this on every journal, so you'll do 5 journals altogether, and you're going to get an average of the 6 readings on each journal. And that's how you're going to figure out what bearing set you're going to need for that journal. Wipe off all your surfaces with a clean rag before you take any kind of measurement. Even if you've already cleaned the surface before, make sure you wipe it off before you take any measurements. Okay, what we're going to do now is mic out the crankshaft. We're going to start with the number 1 main journal here. We're going to do out of round first, which is the center of the surface here. You use a 2 to 3 inch micrometer. And you want to measure this loosely. You never want to turn it with the thimble here, you always want to use the clicker. Make sure you're in the center of the journal. Looks like 2.36065. I'll write that down. Okay, that was our X dimension. Now we're going to get our Y dimension, which is on the opposite side. And again, we're going for out of round, so you want to measure the center. .36065. Go ahead and write that down. Okay, now we're going to mic out number 1 rod journal using a 1 to 2 inch micrometer. We're going to do out of round first, which is the center of the journal. You want to take your time and measure in a few spots to make sure your measurements are accurate. Looks like we got 0.96555 for our X dimension. I'm going to flip my crankshaft to get my Y dimension. Okay, now we're going to mic out our Y dimension. Make sure you don't hit your oiling hole in your journal, or it will throw your measurements off. Try to stay as far away from it as possible. Get 6585 there. We're going to go with 6585. 0.96585. Okay, now we're going to check taper on our journals. But you're going to want to get the inside of the journal and the outside of the journal. And when we did out of round, we did the center of the journal. Okay, now we're going to measure for taper. We're going to get our A dimension first. .36075. Now we'll get our B dimension. .36075. Okay, now we're going to check taper on number 1 rod journal. We're going to get our A dimension now. 96,550. Now we're going to get our B dimension. You won't be able to see the reading because it'll be behind here. .96550. Okay, look at our log sheet here for rod journal number 1. We have the exact same measurement. So what you would do, you'd take A minus B equals your clearance, and since these are both the same, our clearance is 0, but you're allowed 1/10,000th of an inch of taper. So as far as number 1 rod journal, we're good. And then come down here to our main journal number 1. You take A minus B equals your clearance, and since both these are the same, clearance is 0, which is perfect. So on our main journal number 1 and our rod journal number 1, taper is perfect because it's at 0, and you're allowed 1/10,000th of an inch of taper. Looking at our log sheet of out of round, our rod journal, you'll take 1.96555, and that's your X dimension, and you'll minus your X dimension by your Y dimension, so you'll minus 1.96585 equals your clearance of 0.0003, which is 3/10,000ths of an inch. You're only allowed 2/10,000ths of an inch, so we're out of spec by 1/10,000th of an inch on number 1 rod journal, out of round. So what you'd want to do in this case is take it to the machine shop and get them to polish it down 1/10,000th of an inch, because that's how far we're out. And then after you get done with that, you'll have to mic it out again and check your clearances for your oil clearance to see if you're within spec on that, because you might have to use undersized bearings. And then go into main journal number 1. Our measurements are all the same, so our clearance is 0, because you take X minus Y equals your clearance. Since they're both the same, it's going to be 0. So we're within spec on our main journal number 1. Okay, we have all our log sheets laid out here to get our main oil clearances. You can download all these log sheets off my website if you want to use them. And if you're going to do it, as far as your main oil clearance sheet, you want to print out 5 of these because you have 5 journals to get the main oil clearance from. Looking over here is our crankshaft. This is our main journal number 1, out of round. This is our taper here, which these 2 numbers are the same and these 2 numbers are the same. So to get the average, we're going to take 2.36065 plus 2.36075, and you're going to divide that by 2 because you got 2 numbers. That's going to give you an average of 2.3607. So that's what we're going to write right here, because this is our main crank journal. And then to get the main girdle ID with the bearing crush set, that's what we had up here. With our number 1 journal, we did the average and set our dial bore gauge up to 0.0204 and then zeroed it out and got the reading of 2.36290. So that's what we'll write here, 2.36290. So what you're going to do is you're going to minus this by this. It's going to give you a clearance of 0.0022. Now looking here, standard is 0.0008 to 0.0019, but this is for a stock motor. Since we're building a performance turbo motor, you want to get a little more clearance out of it because things are going to swell when they get hot and you're going to be revving in high RPMs and such. So you want to go a little higher. Rule of thumb for these engines, you want to be around 0.02 of an inch clearance. If you go about 2.5, which will be 25 here, I'd not lose any sleep over that. But if you start getting around 0.03, that's when I'd start thinking you're a little too far out. You want to get a little less clearance than that. So in between 20 and 25, you should be good. Any more or less than that, I would probably get another bearing to make up the differences there. And you're going to want to do this on every single journal you have, all 5 journals. Like the example I gave before, if you were out 4/10,000ths of an inch, this would actually be 0.0026. That would actually be 4/10,000ths of an inch of more clearance. And with that being said, that would be 0.0026. I would probably go ahead and go with a thicker bearing than that, just to get closer to 2. Because if this was 0.0020, that would be your ideal clearance. That's where you'd really want to be at. Okay, here's the chart for your connected rod bearings, the standard ones. You have 3 grades. You have 0, which is no color, then brown and green. The 0, no color, is 0.0593 to 0.0594, which is 1/10,000th difference. The brown is 0.0594, 0.0595, which is 1/10,000th. The green is 0.0595 to 0.0596, which is 1/10,000th. So what you're going to want to do is the set of bearings that you bought, you want to mic them out and see which range they're in on this, because you're going to have to install the bearings onto the rod and measure the inner diameter with the dial bore gauge. These are your rod bearings. They both are smooth. They have no oiling hole groove. They both have oiling holes, but since we're using aftermarket rods, we don't have to worry about the oiling holes. But there's no specified top or bottom bearing. They're both the same. They both have a little groove on them here to attach it to the rod and the rod cap. Go ahead and mic them out now. .05940. I want to measure on both sides, just to make sure you're getting accurate readings and that the bearing is not tapered. .05940. Now we'll measure the other bearing. We'll measure the other side. It's the same. As far as your bearings, if you ordered a standard set of bearings, every single bearing should mic out the same. So looking at the chart again, our bearings measured out at .05940. So basically that puts us in the category of 0 or the brown bearing. because the 0 is 0.0594 on the thick end, and then the brown is 0.0594 to 0.0595. So we're within this range. So I'm going to call the bearings that we have brown. And now what we'll do, we'll install the bearings onto the rods in the rod cap and torque the rod down and measure the inner diameter. And then we'll take our crankshaft rod journal, outer diameter, and minus the 2, and that's going to give us our oil clearance. What I have here is the Eagle connecting rod. It's the H-beam. It's got the ARP rod bolts on it. They're already torqued down when they come out of the box, so I just used the air gun and took them off. Okay, what you're going to do to get the cap off is just take a rubber mallet and tap on it. Just gotta break it loose. And you get a little bit of a crack on it, you should be able to pull it off with your hands after that. It's held on by these pins on the cap here. They actually go into there. I have a standard set of rod bearings here. They're both exactly the same, so you don't have a top or a bottom. I'll go ahead and install these in. Okay, you have a groove on the bearing here, and you have a groove on the rod here. And this actual bearing has a oiling hole in it, but the rods here don't. But you don't have to worry about that. Just go ahead and put that groove into that groove and smash the bearing down into place. Just make sure it's kind of flush on each side. And then the same with the cap. Has a groove on it here, where the bearing has a groove on it. And if you would have paid attention when you took this apart, you would know that there is no stamps on this side, and on this side there's stamps. So that's one way you can know that you're putting it together properly. Another way to know is the little groove on this side and the groove on the cap side actually go together like so. And just smash them together. They'll close up when we go to tighten it up. Go ahead and install your ARP bolts. These already have lube on them. If yours didn't, you would want to install some lube on there. Go ahead and tighten them down. They're 11 millimeter and they're 12 point. You can notice on here, my bearing, it's sitting over a little ways. I need to straighten that out. After you got it loosened up, don't take it all the way off. Just get a little crack in there and go ahead and straighten up your bearing. As you'll see now, I've straightened the bearing out. You can see on both sides there. What's happening is this side over here has the grooves on it, so it lines that side up, but this side over here does not have any grooves. So you want to keep an eye on that, make sure you have that right. The torque on these ARP rod bolts is 45 foot-pounds. So what I'd do is I'd take the rod, put it in a vise, put a towel around it or something, put it in a vise, and then torque it down to 45 foot-pounds, and then we'll spec it out. Okay, I have a 2.0 pin in my dial bore gauge, and I have it zeroed out. I have my bearings installed on my rod, and my rod bolts torqued down to 45 foot-pounds. I just put the rod in a vise with the towel around it and torque down the rod bolts. Now what we're going to do is measure the ID of the rods here. This side over here I'm considering my top, and this side over here I'm considering my bottom, which the top over here has the eagle on it, because these particular eagle rods have an eagle on here, and on the other side they just have some numbers. So the eagle side I'm considering my top, and the other side my bottom. We're going to go for the right side, which it really doesn't matter which side you call the right side or the left side, because you're going to measure all three anyways. But we'll go ahead and start now with the top right side. It's like 0.0588. Now do the bottom right side. 0.0589. Now I'll do the left side, top. .0588. Do the bottom. .0588. Now we'll do the center on the top. .0592. Bottom, center. .0593. Now we're going to take all 6 of our measurements and add them all together to get our average. .0588 plus .0589 plus .0588 plus .0588 plus .0592 plus .0593 equals, divided by 6, because you have 6 numbers, equals .0589666. So we're going to round that 9 off to a 10, so it's going to be .0590. That's what we're going to set our dial bore gauge up to. Okay, now we're going to set the dial bore gauge up to .0590 and 0 the gauge out. Now we're set up at negative .0590. Put on the micrometer and 0 the gauge out. If you have a positive reading, you want to back off on the micrometer. And if you have a negative reading, you want to come forward on the micrometer. You want to 0 the gauge out. Make sure your pins are in the center and move it around, making sure that you do not have any more positive readings. 0 it out. Negative reading, negative reading. I'm getting all negative readings. No more positive. So we're set up. This is a 1 to 2 inch micrometer. 1.96125. Okay, this here is our rod journal number 1. This is out of round. This is taper. We're going to get the average from it. So we'll take 1.96550 plus 1.96555 plus 1.96585 equals, divided by 3 because you got 3 numbers, 1.9656333. So we can write that down. 1.96563. Now over here we have our average of our big end rod measurement with the bearing installed, which is 1.96925. is what we zeroed a dial bore gauge out with the micrometer. So we'll write that down. 1.96925. Now you want to minus the 2. That equals 0.00362. Standard is 0.0004 to 0.0014. But again, we're building a turbo motor here, so clearances could be a little higher, like around 2 thousandths. I wouldn't go over 2 thousandths, but as you see here, we're over 3 thousandths here. Okay, since we're out of spec, the only bearing we can use in the standard range is the green bearing, which our bearing mic'd out at 0.05940, and the thickest the green bearing measures out is 0.0596. So that's going to give us 2 10,000ths of an inch more clearance. So minus 0.0002 equals 0.00342. So even with that green bearing, we're not going to have our clearance that we need because we need to be at 2 thousandths. So now we're going to take the crankshaft and get all the rod journals on the crankshaft ground down and use undersized bearings. Even if the other journals on the crankshaft mic'd out good, you would still want to get all the rod journals ground down. You don't want to do just one rod journal. You want to do all 4 of them. And the same with the main journals. If one main journal is out, get all 5 main journals ground down and use undersized bearings. But it works out good for you guys because now you get to see what happens when things go wrong. And on the log sheets here where you see limit, that is basically your fillet roll on the crankshaft journals. Showing you here in this diagram from the factory service manual, it shows you your fillet roll, which right here is your surface of your journal on your crankshaft. You have the fillet roll right here on the edge on both sides. So you'd actually take your gauge and measure the center of that, measure the top of your journal of course, and that's how you get your measurement from that. Okay, since our rod journals were off, we're going to get our crankshaft ground down on the rod journals. You have 3 different thickness of bearings to choose from. But what you're going to want to do is figure out which bearing you're going to need and how much of the crankshaft you're going to need to ground down. Okay, what you want to start with is we have our rod bearings here, the thickness of them that we measured, and then this is the clearance we come out with after everything was done. So what you want to do is you want to figure out what kind of clearance you want to end up with, which we're going to go for 2 thousandths, which is 0.002. That's our ideal clearance. So what you're going to do is take 0.00362, that's what the clearance is we got. You're going to minus 0.002 because that's the ideal clearance that we're wanting, and that equals 0.0162. No, that's wrong. That equals 0.00162. So what you're going to do now is take your bearings that you measured out, 0.05940, and then you're going to add this measurement here, 0.00162, because we want a thicker bearing to get less clearance, because we already have over 3 thousandths, but we're wanting 2 thousandths, so we're wanting less clearance, so we'll need a thicker bearing. That's going to equal 0.06102. And then looking at the chart again from the factory service manual, we're going to look for a bearing that the thickness is 0.06102. And as you see, the top one here doesn't measure that. The second one doesn't either. It goes all the way to 0.0614, which is over what we need because we need 0.06102. So what we're going to do with that, this bearing here actually mics out to 0.0614 to 0.0617. It mics out in that range. I'm just going to go ahead and take an average from that and say it's going to be 0.0615. That's what that bearing's actually going to mic out to when I get it. I know that's just guesstimating, but that's what I'm going to go with. There's no set way that you're going to get that bearing dead on. Okay, now we're going to take the new bearing that we're going to get, which we're hoping is going to mic out to 0.0615, or really close to it. So we're going to take 0.0615, and then we're going to minus this measurement we got here, 0.06102, and that's going to equal 0.00048, which is almost 5/10 thousandths of an inch. Which for this rod journal, this is actually #1 rod journal in the crankshaft, we're going to have to get it ground down 0.00048 inch to be able to use a bearing that is this thickness here. So if we get our #1 rod journal ground down to 0.00048 and we use a 0.0615 thickness bearing, we should come out really close to 2 thousandths oil clearance. And you're going to need to do this on every single rod journal, because you're going to have to get every single rod journal ground down to use undersized bearings. You can't just do one rod journal, you have to do all 4 of them. And the same thing with the mains. If you got to do the mains, you got to do it the exact same way we're doing it here. But looking here on the chart from the factory service manual, you only have one bearing that you can buy for your mains when you're using undersized bearing. There's only one. Where the rods has 3, the mains only have 1. That's how you're going to want to do it. Just to recap, you got your rod bearing thicknesses that you took before you installed it into the motor. We're wanting 2 thousandths clearance. We've got over 3 thousandths clearance, so we minus the 2 from each other, and we end up with 0.00162, and then we're going to add 0.00162 to our rod bearing thickness, which gives us 0.06102. And since they don't have a undersized rod bearing that measures that, we're going to go with a 0.0615 and ground down the crankshaft 0.00048 inch, which is almost 5/10 thousandths of an inch. And that should give us 2 thousandths oil clearance on the rod journal, on our rod journal #1. And again, you're going to do this on all 4 rod journals. Okay, now we're going to remove all of our nuts. We're going to remove it in a 3-step process. We're going to go 1/8 of a turn, 1 through 10, then come back to another 1/8 of a turn, 1 through 10, and then remove them all 1 through 10. Starting with #1. Again, these are 12 millimeter 12 point nuts. Number 2, number 3, number 4, number 5, number 6, number 7, number 8, number 9, and number 10. This is the front of the motor. This is the back of the motor. Now I'll come back, do 1 through 10 again, another 1/8 of a turn. Number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. Now start with number 1 again. Just go ahead and loosen the nut completely. Number 2, number 3, number 4, number 5, number 6, number 7, number 8, number 9, and number 10. Then you go ahead and remove all the nuts and washers completely. The ones where the washer didn't come up with the nut, I always grab the washer and stick it up on the bottom of the nut. It'll stick to it with the assembly lube that's on it. They'll stick together. Let's go ahead and remove them completely. After you got all your nuts off, take something to sit on top of the block so you don't damage the block, and use a pry bar. And you're going to pry up on each corner just a little bit at a time. Just take your time and be very gentle with it. You won't tear anything up. And once you got it pried up, you just go ahead and pour your girdle off. Just pull it straight up. Make sure all your studs are still tight. Okay, we're going to use the S13 which is non-detergent motor oil. This is basically just break-in motor oil. This is what we're going to use to break in the motor. And what you want to do is take a cap full. And pour it down into the oil squirter hole. Put some in each hole. This helps get oil everywhere for startup. It get a little messy, but it's okay. Before you install your oil squirters, you want to clean them off. Just take some parts cleaner, spray them off real good. Shoot some cleaner inside the hole. Make sure it's really clean. You want to clean your bolt off too. What I like to do is shoot a little bit in the hole here, fill it up, and then take a small screwdriver and press down. Because that's actually spring loaded, because there's a hole right here. When you press that in, it opens it up. That's actually how this bolt works. So you just want to clean it out real good, press it in, just shoot some more cleaner in there and just do it a couple times, press it in a couple times. It should be good. Okay, now we're going to install the oil squirters. I'm going to go ahead and have a little bit of oil on your bolt here too. And these are 10mm 12-point bolts, which means you'll need a 12-point socket. These oil squirters get torqued down to 30 foot-pounds. We're using Permatex Ultra Slick engine assembly lube. Just want to put a little bit on the bearings. You want to smooth it out all the way across the surface of the bearing. Here on the thrust bearing, you want to make sure you get some on the sides too, because the crankshaft actually rubs up against the side of here on both sides. Do all your bearings on your girdle too. Again, make sure you get the sides of your thrust bearing. Then you're going to take some assembly lube and put it on your crankshaft journals. Don't do it on the rods yet, just do the mains right now. And take it all the way across the whole surface. Get it covered really good all the way around. You can never have too much of this stuff. After you have everything lubed up, you can go ahead and install your crankshaft. Make sure it's pointing up like this, because if you put it in like this, it'll hit the block and it won't go in. Be extra careful not to hit your journals on your studs. Bring it in very slowly. Give it a couple spins, make sure it's spinning freely. Should spin very freely, no hang-ups at all. Now we'll go ahead and install the girdle. Go ahead and install all your ARP washers and nuts on. If you need some more lube on the threads and on the washers and nuts, go ahead and put it on there. Go ahead and take your 4mm Allen wrench, make sure all your studs are tight. Again, they don't have to be tight at all, they'll be snugged up. Go ahead and snug all our nuts down. Again, making sure you've installed your girdle properly. Your oil dipstick hole goes right here with the groove, and it bends in towards the back. What we're going to do now is start tightening down number 1 and number 2, and get the girdle to go down evenly all the way down to the block. And once they're snugged down, go ahead and snug all the rest of the nuts down. Now what you're going to do, your girdle's loose. I mean, it's all the way down to the block, but it's loose. You're going to take a rubber mallet and tap on the back. Tap on the front. And basically what that's doing is that's lining up your girdle with the block, because there's no stops on the block to line the girdle up properly. And then when you go to torque your girdle down in three-step process, if your crankshaft does not turn freely, then your girdle is not lined up properly. You need to loosen it back up in the three-step process, and then continue hitting on the front and on the back side till you line it up. Okay, our first torque is going to be 15 foot-pounds. Start with number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4, number 5, number 6, number 7, number 8, number 9, and number 10. Now we'll do 31 foot-pounds, starting with number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4, number 5, number 6, number 7, number 8, number 9, and number 10. Now we'll do our final torque of 41 foot-pounds. And again, if you got your main journals, a line hone or board, and you're using the ARP main studs, you will do 60 to 65 foot-pounds in three-step process. Since ours is stock, we got nothing done, we're doing factory specifications. 41 foot-pounds, number 1. Number 2. Number 3. Number 4. Number 5. Number 6. Number 7. Number 8. Number 9. And number 10. Also, some people talk about the stud stretching, but we have installed and removed this girdle quite a few times, so it is already stretched. So we do not have to loosen these and do it again. We're good. And now that you have everything torqued down, your crankshaft should spin very freely still. There should be no hang-ups at all. And if it does not, you'll need to loosen all your nuts again in three-step process, and take the rubber mallet and tap on the back and the front again. You might even need to hit a little harder, because it takes a good bit of force to move this crankshaft, because hitting the crankshaft is what's lining up the girdle straight. If you have the money, I highly recommend getting the rotating assembly balanced, which you would need the crankshaft, you would need the crank pulley, you would need the flywheel, you would need the pistons and rods. Basically the whole rotating assembly would need to be balanced all together. This particular motor did not get it done, but I highly recommend doing it if you have the money to do it, especially if you're using new pistons and rods, because the factory crank is balanced for the factory rods and pistons, and the factory flywheel and the factory crank pulley. So if you have aftermarket pulley, aftermarket flywheel, aftermarket pistons and rods, I highly recommend you get the whole rotating assembly balanced. Okay, when you're going to file fit your rings, for this particular piston, this is the top ring. It has a dot on it to show you that this is the top, because if you flip it over, it doesn't have a dot on it. So that's showing you that that's the top. And we're looking for 20 to 22 thousandths of a ring gap right here. So what you want to do when you go to install it is you'll squeeze the ring together like that, and you'll install it to the bore. And then you'll need to square it up. Just use the piston. You got a flat top piston. And then push down on it. I always push down on it until the skirts are level with the deck of the block, and then pull the piston out. Now the piston ring is squared up. Starting with a 16 thousandths feeler gauge, we'll check the gap. It goes in freely. Now we'll check with a 17. It's pretty tight in there, but it fits. So we need to file it down a little more, because we're going for 20 to 22 thousandths, which on my top ring I'm going to go for 20. Just squeeze the piston ring together and pull it up. I just turn it up like that and then squeeze it together and pull it up so you don't scratch the cylinder wall surface. One really important thing when you're cutting your piston ring, when you squeeze onto the cutting blade here, you want to make sure that your gaps are straight, because if it's crooked a little bit like that or like that, it's going to cut the gap crooked and it's not going to seal properly. And it all depends on how hard you squeeze the ring while you're turning the blade as to how much you're going to be cutting off. It's a trial and error process. I would take a set of used piston rings and just test with it until you get the feel for how much you're actually going to be cutting off, because you don't want to waste a set of piston rings. You're going to want to just cut a little bit at a time and keep checking, because you don't want to cut too much off. Where this one in particular was 16 thousandths, we're going to go for 20 thousandths on it. So we've got to cut a little bit off of it. That's what you're going to do. You're going to put it in the bore, check it with a feeler gauge, and then bring it over here to the cutter, cut a little bit off, take it back, put it in the cylinder bore, check it with a feeler gauge, and just keep doing that process until you get the ring gap that you need. Where in our case, it's calling for 20 thousandths to 22 thousandths. We're going to go with 20 thousandths on ours. So we'll just keep checking and cutting until we get there. Okay, this is our fourth try of filing the ring down and checking it with a feeler gauge. We were at 19 last time, so we should be really close to 20 this time. Now we're checking with a 20 thousandths feeler gauge. It goes in and fits snugly. So we'll try 21. Try 21. Where it starts to go in, gets halfway and gets stuck. So we're good. That's 20 thousandths of gap. When you get done gapping these rings, either install them on the piston or put them in a bag and label what they are. Like for instance, this would be the top number 2 piston ring, and it has 20 thousandths ring gap. This ring here is the second ring. It has a dot on top and also has a slight angle cut on the inside, where if you flip it over, it's totally flat and there's no dot, so you know that this is the top. We'll check it the exact same way. Go ahead and install it into the bore. Square it up with the piston. This ring here calls for 22 to 24 thousandths. I'm going to start with a 17 thousandths feeler gauge. It's pretty tight, so we go ahead and do some filing. Just pull it out the same way, just pull it straight up and then squeeze it together and pull it up. Okay, this is our 5th time checking the second ring. Again, this ring calls for 22 to 24 thousandths of ring gap. I'm going to go with 22 on this one. We're going with 20 on our top and 22 on our second here. So we go ahead and install it into the bore. Should be close because last time we were on 21. Go ahead and square the ring up with the piston. Push it down into the bore. Make it level with the deck of the block. The ring is squared up. Using the 22 thousandths feeler gauge. Check our gap. It goes in very snugly. We'll try 23 now. It goes halfway in and gets stuck, so we're good with 22. So this ring's done. Again, either put it on the piston or put it in a bag and label what it is. This will be number 2, second piston ring, and the piston ring gap is 22 thousandths. And as far as the ring gaps, where I got my measurements from was from AMS, because I bought my pistons from them and that's what they call for. I did not go off the factory service manual for the piston ring gap. Okay, here we have our top ring, which is to be gapped 20 to 22 thousandths. We gapped ours at 20 thousandths. This is our second ring, which is to be gapped 22 to 24 thousandths. We gapped ours at 22 thousandths. This is the spacer, You don't gap this at all. And these two here are oiling rings. We don't gap these either. We just leave these what they are straight out of the box. And this is a full set of piston rings for one piston. So you have 4 sets of these because we have 4 pistons. Okay, now we're going to measure the crankshaft end play. We're going to take a pry bar and press against the crankshaft and the block to push the crankshaft this way onto the gauge here. And your specs are .0012 to .0071. We'll go ahead and do that now. I'm just going to take the pry bar and put it on the block and press on the crankshaft. And then we'll read our gauge while we're doing this. You want to watch the crankshaft, don't let it turn on you. That could throw your number off. Got 33 right now. I want to press on with a good bit of force, make sure you're pressing it all the way. We're getting 33, so we're within spec. Now we'll do it this direction. It's going to be negative this time. 29, so we're within spec on this crankshaft. Basically what that's doing is checking your crankshaft on your thrust bearing, because your crankshaft butts up against the thrust bearing on both sides, and we're just moving the crankshaft back and forth on the thrust bearing to make sure we're within spec on that. And we're good on this one. And all we're using here is just a magnetic base stand for your gauge. You just turn it off and the magnet cuts off. And as you can see on the back of my gauge here, it has a lip that hooks on, so it screws on right there. That's basically how that works. And then I got a pin on my gauge here. It's a longer pin to touch the end of the crankshaft there. Okay, we got all the rods taken apart. This rod here already has the bearings in. We'll go ahead and install all the bearings in all the rods. There's no top or bottom bearing. Again, try to make sure you get them in the center as much as possible here before you go to install them. Okay, I always like to take the piston pin lock and go ahead and install it on one side first. These locks here for these pistons, actually got to stretch them out and spiral these in. Some are different, they have little pins on them so you can squeeze them with the pliers. These here you just want to stretch them out just a little bit. Definitely be careful though, you don't want to break them. And you just spiral them in, that's all you got to do. Takes a little bit of maneuvering to get them in. As soon as you get it going, it should be good. You just stretch it in there, because you'll get it to go down in the crack like so. And then you just keep going all the way around. As you can see, it's starting to go in. Just use your fingernail to get it in there. And then when you get to the last part of it, use a flathead screwdriver right on the tab here. But be extra careful not to scratch the piston. And just make sure it's in the groove in there. And it's installed. Okay, now you're going to mount the rod onto the piston. So go ahead and take you some assembly lube and get on the inside of the piston holes. Smear it all the way around the whole surface there. You want to get it good and lubed up. And then do the other side. And go ahead and lube up the inside of your rod here. Go ahead and lube up your pin. And as far as what goes where, I'm going to put the eagle towards the front of the engine, and then I'm going to point the markings on the bottom of the piston the same direction as the eagle, because these actual pistons here don't have any kind of dot or anything on top. If it had a dot on it, that would go towards the front of the motor. Since these don't, just go ahead and assemble them like this. I have my pin on this side over here that we already installed. It's going to be a tight fit. You want to press your pin all the way down until it goes all the way to the other side and touches the pin. And it moves around very freely. There's no play in this at all, but it still moves freely. Okay, now that all that's installed, we'll go ahead and stretch this lock out on this side. We'll go ahead and install it. You want to make sure your pin's pressed down enough that your groove is there. It's a little harder with all the assembly lube on there. It makes it a little more difficult to get in. Just want to take your time, make sure you're getting it in there. You want to make sure your lock's all the way in the groove. Be extra careful not to scratch the pin surface or anything, because you don't want to mess up your movement of your pin. Because as you can see, your pin still moves, and if you hold the pin, the rod will still move, because there's actually the bushing on the rod too. So all three surfaces are moving separately. The rod's moving, the pin's moving, and the piston's moving. But you want to make sure that you don't scratch anything, or it'll damage that. But this piston and rod assembly is installed. We'll go ahead and do all the rest the exact same way. Have my lock installed on this side. Go ahead and lube it up. And make sure you get everything lubed up really good. Because if you look inside this rod here, it has the little brass bushing inside there. And again, I'm putting the eagle on the same side with the markings on the piston. Install the lock in. It's a little tough to get it started, but once you get it started, it goes in pretty easy. Number 2 is installed. You want to go ahead and mark which cylinder bore these are going to go into. Like the first one we just did, number 1. This is going to be number 2, and then 3 and 4. We'll go ahead and install this lock on this piston now. That one's installed. We'll go ahead and lube it all up. just want to line the piston rod hole up with the piston here. Insert the piston pin. The piston pin should go in the piston very easily. Should slide right in like that. It'll be a tight fit, but it should slide right in. Make sure it's pressed all the way down. Now we'll go ahead and install this lock. Stretch it out. And it's locked in. Make sure everything turns freely. Grab the piston pin like that, move it around, move the rod around. Number 3 is done. Now we'll go ahead and install this lock. That one's installed. You can totally do it with your fingers and fingernails. You don't need a screwdriver. So I would definitely try to do it without a screwdriver so you don't risk damaging the piston. Go ahead and lube it up. Okay, now I'll install it. Okay, now we'll go ahead and install the last lock. You just want to stretch them out just a little bit. You don't want to stretch them out too far, and you definitely don't want to break them. Now it's installed. Move the rod around, move the pin around, get everything lubricated really well. Okay, now we're going to install the piston rings. As far as my pistons, they all mic'd out the same, so it really doesn't matter which one I use. But if yours mic'd out different, then you would want to put it in that cylinder bore that you spec'd it out for. But I have marked all my piston rings and put them in baggies. This is our number 4 piston rings. So we're going to install everything now. This is your spacer. Has an end on it there. You want to make sure that butts up together. You don't want it overlapping like this or anything. You just want to butt it up together like that. You want to install this first because it has little ends on the side of it here, which the oiling rings actually sit on. So you wouldn't be able to put the oiling ring on first and then put this on. This has to go on first. And it goes on the bottom groove here. We'll go ahead and install it. And you can just make sure that it's together like that. Just butt up together. It's not overlapping each other. Now we'll take our oil ring. You have 2 oil rings, the top and the bottom. They're exactly the same. There's no top or bottom to them either. So we'll go ahead and install that. They make a piston ring expander, which basically grabs the gap here and squeezes it open. And it just pulls it open so you can slide over the piston. But I'm not going to use those. I'm just going to do it by hand. You want to be extra careful doing it by hand though. You don't want to pull it apart too much because you could actually break the ring, which of course you don't want to do. But get this side here started. This one's going to go underneath the spacer, and you're just going to go all around the piston. While you hold this side with this finger, just go around the piston with this finger, and slide it down into place. And it's installed. Now we'll go ahead and do the next one. This one's going to go on the top of the spacer. Get it installed on there. And it's installed. The gaps actually go in a certain orientation on the piston, but we'll do that after we get everything installed. Now we're going to do our second ring, and these have a dot on the top, and on the bottom they do not. And they also have the angle cut on the inside of them. We'll go ahead and install it. This is going to be a little harder because it's a lot stiffer of a ring, but it works the same way. Squeeze it apart, slide it over the piston. And you want it to get to go in the right groove there. And just grab it and squeeze it over like that. See how that went on there? And then make sure it's in the groove all the way around. And that one's installed. Now we'll do the top ring. It has the dot on top. There's no dot on the bottom. So we'll install it on. This top ring right here is actually catching a little bit because when we file fit it, where we cut it with the wheel, it's actually made a little burr on it, so we need to take it off and file that down because you don't want anything to mess with the movement of the ring. You just want to take your file or stone or whatever you got and just get the burrs off the edges here. You don't want to do too much because you don't want to mess with your ring gap. You just want to get the sharp edges off. And it's a good idea to do this on all the piston rings that you cut. And do it on both sides. And always go down into the piston ring. You can just feel it with your finger, make sure there's no burr on it at all. Make sure it's not catching your finger anywhere. Now we'll go ahead and install it back on the piston. Dots on top. You want to make sure the piston ring moves very freely. Has no hang-ups now at all. It moves very freely. You want to make sure all your rings do this. We didn't cut any on the bottom, but you want to make sure they turn freely too. And before we go to install this, we'll oil this whole piston and all the rings on it too. We'll go ahead and install all the rings on all of our pistons. We'll go ahead and install the spacer. We'll go ahead and install the bottom O-ring. Now we'll install the top O-ring. Make sure everything turns freely. Go ahead and install our second ring, making sure there's no hang-ups on it. Okay, now we'll go ahead and install our second ring. Dots up. Once you get in the groove, make sure it moves around freely. Install our top ring, the dot on top. I've done filed this ring down, all the burrs off of it. And it moves freely. That piston's done. Okay, now we'll install our spacer. Making sure it's butting up against each other, not overlapping. Install our bottom oiling ring. My spacer popped off. Get it back down. And now everything moves freely, side to side and in and out of the piston. Install our top oiling ring. Now we'll install our second ring, dots on top. And we'll install our top ring, dot pointing up. It moves in and out freely and side to side, no hang-ups there. That piston's done. Go ahead and install our spacer on our last piston. We'll install our bottom oiling ring. Make sure everything moves freely. Install our top oiling ring. Make sure everything moves freely. Okay, now we'll install our second ring. Dot pointed up. I've already filed the burrs off this one. Get it in the groove, move it around, make sure there's no hang-ups, it moves freely. We'll install our top ring, dot pointed up. I've already filed the burrs off this one as well. It still catches a little bit, so I'm going to take it back off and file it down some more. Again, you don't want to go too far with this. You don't want to file the inside of it because you'll mess with your 5-fit ring gap there. You just want to get the burrs off of it. That's all you're doing. And now I'll install it back on. Okay, now it moves much freer now. So we're good to go on that one. Okay, going off this diagram from your factory service manual, this is the front of the piston, so that's pointing towards the front of the motor. The gap on your top ring is going to be over here on this side. This is the front of the motor, so it's going to be over here on this side. Your second ring is going to be on the opposite side of the piston. Your oil ring expander is here, which we are calling our spacer. And then your oiling rings, your upper oiling ring is on the same side as your top ring. And then your lower oiling ring is over here. So like I stated before, my eagle on my rod is going to be pointing forward to the front of the motor. So this is going to be the front of my piston here. So I need to get my top ring's gap over here. So I will grab it and put it there. My top ring is there. So here's the front of my piston, and here's my top ring gap right here. Second ring gap needs to be on the opposite side. So we'll take it and we'll spin it around. Over here. So now we have my second ring gap here. We have my top ring gap here. The front of my piston's right here. Okay, now we're going to go for the O-ring expander, or the spacer, whatever you want to call it. I'm just going to use a little small flathead screwdriver to turn it. It's right here. So it's right here now. Top of my piston's right here. My expander or spacer is right here. Now we need to do the O-rings. Okay, now we're going to go for the lower O-ring. The front of the piston's right here, so it needs to go over here. I'm just using a little small flathead screwdriver. And if your expander ring or your spacer ring is wanting to go with it, just hold it with your thumb. Okay, the front of the piston's here. Your lower O-ring is right here. And our expander ring is over here. So now we need to get the top O-ring over here with the top ring. And it's there. So you got your top ring gap here. You got your top O-ring gap here. Your spacer expander should be right here. Move it over a little more. Then your lower is right there. Your lower O-ring is right there. And then the front of the piston's here. The second ring gap should be right here. So we're all lined up on this piston. We'll go ahead and line up all the rest of our piston rings on our pistons now. Okay, now we'll go ahead and lube everything up. All our piston rings are in the right spot. Go ahead and put some assembly lube on the bearings. Smooth it out all over the whole surface. Being very careful with your piston rings, making sure you do not move them. Make sure your piston ring compressor tool is clean. We'll oil it up too. You want to use the 30 weight non-detergent motor oil. Just get it all on the inside of your piston ring compressor tool. What I'm going to do, I'm going to take my finger and stick it on all the rings. Get some oil on my finger. Just go all over the surface of the piston and the rings. Again, trying your best not to move your rings. And when you get all in there, grab your rings and move them back and forth while making sure all of them is moving together. So you want to get some good lubrication on there. You can also go ahead and check the front. It's got the eagle on it. We'll go ahead and check the orientation and everything again. Our top ring's lined up. Our second ring's lined up. Our top O-ring is lined up. Our spacer's lined up. And our bottom oiling ring is lined up. So this piston's ready to go. Okay, now what we're going to do is install the piston ring compressor onto the piston. And tighten it down. Basically all this is doing is compressing your piston rings into your piston so it'll slide down to the cylinder bore on the block. Now we want to go ahead and lube up the rod journal. Make sure you get it all the way around the journal completely. You don't want any kind of metal surfaces touching without any kind of lube on it. I'm going to go ahead and lube up my number 4 journal too. Because while they're both pointing down like this, you'll be able to install the pistons and rods. Where 2 and 3 is pointing up, we wouldn't be able to get to the rod bolts as easy. So we'll do number 1 and number 4 first. And install it all, torque everything down, and then we'll turn the crankshaft over to get the number 2 and number 3 rod journals on the bottom. Now we'll turn the motor over and lube up the cylinder walls. And we'll make sure your hand's clean. Go ahead and install some motor oil on the cylinder walls. You don't want to use any kind of synthetic motor oil. You want to make sure the entire cylinder wall is covered in oil. Now you bring your piston and rod in, and the rod bearing's already lubed up, the piston's already lubed up, the ring's already lubed up. You want to leave a little bit of your piston skirt hanging down from the piston ring compressor. So you'll be able to line it up on the bore. The eagle is going to face forward because that's what we're doing. You want to make sure your rod goes in straight because it's going to go down and connect with the crankshaft, so you don't want it to be crooked or you could scratch the journal on your crankshaft. You want to bring it in, line it up, and then just take the rubber end of the hammer and tap it down in. It's in. You just hold the rod with your hand underneath while you tap the piston down, just to make sure you're not going to scratch up your rod journals or your crankshaft. Just go slow. And we're all the way down now. Now we'll go ahead and lube up number 4 cylinder. Go ahead and loosen up the ring compressor. Now we'll go ahead and lube this piston and rings up. Make sure all your piston rings are lined up. Everything's lined up. I'm going to install into the piston ring compressor tool. Everything is lined up and lubed up. Go ahead and tighten it down. Okay, now I'm installing to the bore. Making sure our rod is straight, making sure the eagle is pointing towards the front of the motor. Everything's lubed up. Tap it down. Okay, it's installed. Now we'll go underneath and grab the rod with our hands. What I'm doing is I'm cupping the my middle finger and my thumb fingers going around the rod journal, and I'm going to wait till the rod comes down and touches my fingers. I'm going to line it up with the journal like that as I tap it down. And we're down. Okay, now I flip the motor over, you'll see the rod is all the way up to the journal here. We'll go ahead and take the rod cap, put some lube on the bearing, smooth it out. This side of the cap has no numbers on it, and this side does. And also, as far as these eagle rods, there's numbers on the bottom, which this one in particular is 06927. This side of the rod has that exact same number. And they all have different numbers on the bottom like that, so you can keep them in order. So we'll go ahead and install this. Just slide it down on there, and take your rod bolts. And if you don't have ARP lube on them already, go ahead and put some on there. These already have them. Thread them in. These are 11mm 12-point bolts, which means you'll need a 12-point socket. And they will be torqued down to 45 foot-pounds. Again, torque these down to 45 foot-pounds. Now we'll go ahead and do number 4. And put some lube on the bearing. Smear it out all the way around the bearing. This one's the same way. It has no number on this side, and it has a number on this side. And the number on this one is 07073, which is what I have over here. So we'll line the numbers up, install the cap, install your ARP rod bolts with the lube on it. And torque them down to 45 foot-pounds. I like to get both bolts pretty snug before I start torquing. Okay, those two are done. Okay, with the crank pulley bolt installed, it's 27mm. We'll go ahead and turn the crankshaft over to get number 2 and number 3 rod journal on top. And you're also going to do this making sure that everything goes smoothly. You have number 1 and number 4 piston and rod already installed, so it should still spin fairly freely. The only hang-ups you're going to have is the piston ring sliding on the cylinder walls. Okay, now I'm going to go ahead and lube up the rod journals. Now we'll turn the motor over. Now we'll go ahead and lube up the bearing on the rod cap. We're doing number 2 now. And make sure your bearing on your rod still has good lube on it. We'll go ahead and lube up our piston and rings for number 2. We'll move them around. Make sure they got good lubrication on the rings and the piston. And when you get done with that, make sure all your rings are lined up still. We're good on this one. We're going to install the piston and the piston ring compressor. Now we'll go ahead and lube up the cylinder wall. Now we're going to install the rod. Eagle pointing forward. Line the rod up. Install the skirts onto the bore. Take your hammer and tap it down in the bore. Now you want to come down here and put your fingers around the rod journals and tap down the piston. And then guide the rod over the rod journal so you're not going to scratch the rod journal. And we're down. Okay, now we're going to lube up number 3 piston. After everything's lubed up, make sure all your piston rings are still lined up. Okay, now we'll go ahead and install piston into the compressor. And we'll go ahead and lube up number 3 cylinder. Okay, now with the eagle pointing forward, we'll line the rod up, install the piston into the bore, take our hammer and tap it down. Now it's in there, we'll come down here and guide the rod around the rod journal. And we're all the way down. Now we'll flip the motor over. And with our rod caps lubed up, we'll get the numbers lined up for the cap. Numbers on this side, the numbers on this side of the rod. Install the cap. Install the ARP rod bolts with lube on them. Go ahead and torque them down to 45 foot-pounds. Go ahead and lube this rod bearing up. Smooth it all over the surface. We'll align the numbers with the cap of the rod. Install the cap. Install the ARP rod bolts with lube on them. Now we'll torque them down to 45 foot-pounds. Now that everything is lubed up and torqued down to spec, all four of your pistons and rods are all installed. We'll go ahead and turn the crankshaft over to make sure everything spins freely. It's going to have a little bit of force on it now because you got all four of your pistons in. And now, after we got everything turned and moved around, we'll go ahead and check the connecting rod side clearance, which standard is 0.008 to 0.016. What you want to do here is you want to take the feeler gauge and get it inside the crack of the rod cap and the crankshaft. And if your feeler gauge will go through there, then that's your clearance. But it needs to be tight. It needs to go in there tightly. We're going to start off with a 0.016 feeler gauge. You want to check in between the crankshaft here and the rod. Make sure that you can't get the feeler gauge in there at all. Can't get a 16 in there. Then we're going to try a 14. 14 goes in there. So now we'll try 15. 15 goes in there. The 16 does not go in there, so we're good on this one. I'll go ahead and check number 3 here. 16 won't go in there. Try 13. 13 goes in there, so we're good on that one. Turn the crankshaft over. Check number 1 with a 13. 13 won't go in there. Try 12. 12 goes in there, so we're good. We'll try number 4 with a 12. 12 goes in there. Try 15. 15 just barely goes in there. So we're good on all 4 of our rod side clearances. You got your rear main seal plate and then your rear main seal. Just go ahead and spray it all with some cleaner. Clean it up real good. And using a seal puller, we're going to pull the old seal out. You just step on it with your feet. And just pull up on it like that. Okay, after you have your plate all cleaned up and your old oil seal pulled out, take your new seal, cover it in motor oil. I'm going to cover the entire surface with motor oil, especially the inside for startup. And then we'll cover the outside of it here, make it easier to install. I'm going to put a little bit on the inside here. of the plate. Go ahead and start pressing in by hand. Sometimes you can press them in by hand, sometimes you need a seal tool. Where this one here went in by hand, but this is a seal tool here. Basically, this comes with various size pieces on here, and you just stick it over the gasket, and then take a hammer and then tap it down into the plate here. This one here went in by hand. You want to make sure it's pressed down all the way around. You can flip it over on the back. These stops right here is what the gasket stops on. So you can just look on the back here and make sure it's all the way down, all the way around. Okay, now we'll go ahead and run a bead of RTV around the remaining seal plate here. I want to make sure the surface is dry and clean. And you don't need to put any on the bottom. We'll do that when we go to install the oil pan. You have 6 10mm bolts. You have 2 long ones. They go on the bottom of the plate. The other 4 go on top here. I got some motor oil in the cap here. I'm just going to dip the threads down in them when I go to install it. So I'll make sure they get a good torque. Okay, before you go install your remaining seal plate, make sure your surface right here where it's going to meet, where the RTV is going to meet the block, make sure it's all clean. Now you got your rear main seal installed on the plate. Everything's cleaned up. You got your RTV on there. Go ahead and install it on the block. When you go to install it, you want to kind of turn it while you're putting it on. And there's 2 pins right here that line up with these holes. Go ahead and tap the pins in. You got the 2 longer bolts on the bottom here. Don't forget to dip them in some motor oil. Or if you had some ARP assembly lube left over, you could use that too. Install all the shorter bolts now. Dipping them in oil too. Now we'll go ahead and snug all the bolts down. They're 10mm. There's no particular order. The torque on these is 56.4 to 66 inch-pounds. Since that's such a small of a torque, I'm going to do it by hand. You just want to snug them up. Don't get them too tight because these bolts can break very easily because they're small. And all the excess RTV that come off the bottom here, I go ahead and just wipe it off. Because it's going to get RTV on it when we go to install the oil pan. And all this surface rust on the front here, I'm just going to go ahead and take some motor oil and wipe on it. Again, all this come from when they hot tanked it, they dipped it in the hot tank. And it didn't get any kind of lube on it or paint or anything, so I just wanted to surface rust a little bit. Not going to hurt anything at all. Okay, now we'll go ahead and lube up the keyways and the crankshaft here on the end. We'll go ahead and lube up the inside of our sprocket here. Go ahead and install it on. You can tell this is the front because it has a dot on it. It's a timing mark. And it has a little notch on it here which lines up on the keyways there. Go ahead and take your rubber mallet and tap it on. You go ahead and line up with the back keyway. And it's all the way back, it's installed. Now we'll go ahead and install our spacer, go ahead and lube it up. This is actually what turns the oil pump. Slides on the same way. And once it's back up against the sprocket, it's installed. Okay, that's the complete install of your short block. We can't go any further on assembling the long block until you get the head on. So in the next video, part 3, the head build video, we're going to rebuild the head, we're going to install the motor, and then we'll finish assembling the long block.